Good evening and welcome to Face for the Newsfirst team. I'm Niresh Aliatambi. The violent uprising in Nepal has shocked the world. Arson, looting, and a violent military crackdown have been the order of the day. What ramifications does this have for South Asia and possibly for India and Sri Lanka individually, all of which we are tied together, aren't we? And to discuss all this, I have with me Mr. Nilanthan Niruthan, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Law and Security Studies, also known as CLASS. Good evening and welcome back to the show, Nilanthan.
Good evening, always happy to be here.
Right, so let's start with Nepal. Shocking scenes.
Yes.
And Nepal is a country which is, you generally have the cultural stereotype of an easygoing population, happy-go-lucky people. When you visit Nepal, they're always so nice. But politically, they have had a lot of issues over the decades. They had a monarchy, and then there was a lot of violence within the monarchy, and then finally they moved to democracy. But that doesn't seem to have worked out so far.
Yes.
What's the scenario and the historic the trail
Yes.
to know?
So as you rightly pointed out, they had about 150 years of monarchy. In 1990, you had the first real major protest where you then had a multi-party democracy that was allowed to also flourish under the monarchy. You then had the Maoist insurgency, unfortunately, which kind of stalled their growth. In 2006, the Maoists then come into the political system. In 2008, it officially stops being a monarchy and becomes a republic. And unfortunately, since then, they've had something like 14 prime ministers, as in 3 guys who've taken turns being prime minister 14 times. So it's a very claustrophobic political environment in that sense, where the people feel that they have no voice. And the worst part is that over the last year or so, the two main parties have come together. So there's no dissent in parliament either. So the Nepal political class has now more or less united, which created a lot of dissatisfaction among the youth of Nepal. On this point, if we could just look at some interesting statistics, the average age of a Nepali citizen is less than 25. So to put that in context, if I'm not mistaken, for us, it's something like 31 or 30. For India, it's something like 29 or 30. Whereas with Nepal, the average age is below 25.
That's a lot of young people.
A lot of young people, and about 15 to 20% of Nepal now live abroad because of limited job opportunities in the home region and so on. In the 1990s, very few Nepalis even had a passport because the monarchy was not big on allowing the general citizenry to travel around the world. It was only the Gurkhas who could access international travel, but it was just a small percentage of their population who even had a passport. So imagine going from that to now, where 20% of your population lives abroad. So there's a huge rushed globalization process that has happened as well. And that's why the social media ban was almost like a matchstick thrown on the powder keg, so to speak. Because imagine 20% of your population's outside. Almost every country has somebody from, almost every family has someone from their household who lives abroad. I think something like 1/3 of the Nepalese GDP is foreign remittances. And all of this requires social media to run. You use WhatsApp to communicate with your family members living abroad. You use social media to monetize small and medium businesses. So all of this created a big powder keg, so to speak. The corruption and the nepotism has been very systemic, to the point where the youth felt very disenfranchised, I suppose, which resulted in the tragic bloodshed that you mentioned at the start of the program. This is unfortunately what happens when the political class is in their 70s and the average age of the citizenry is in its 20s, and the political class is simply not interested in listening to the grievances of those in their 20s.
Well, when you say that the two major parties basically started collaborating, then they stop representing the population, the
Exactly.
voters.
Exactly.
So you have that political class, and then you have the citizenry, and they are poles apart, and something is going to blow.
Exactly. I mean, I often ask people this, right? Try to go look up when the last time there was a heated debate in the Nepali parliament. It would have been a while ago, because the two major political factions have all come together, so there's no real dissent in parliament either. And on top of that, you then ban social media where there's no dissent at all. And it's interesting, right? One of the reasons given for the banning of social media was that there are too many young Nepalis living abroad who are flaunting their wealth on all these platforms like Instagram and all that, and that this is creating a negative impact on the local youth here. Now, there might be a certain element of truth to that, but I don't think any legitimate government can ban social media under the official excuse given is, oh, too many of them are rich and successful outside, and we don't really want you to see your peers having a good life outside. That's a very North Korean doctrine in terms of media handling.
Oh, absolutely. And what strikes me is that the remarkable similarities to Sri Lanka. Um, Sri Lanka during the Aragalaya period, because basically we ourselves also had just a few prime ministers and presidents. So you had the Rajapaksas, you had Wickramasinghe, you had Sirisena. Basically, for the last 20 odd years, we have had about 4 individuals who have dominated, and they themselves are viewed as the political class, and not, and they seem to have become distant to the population.
Yes.
So again, powder keg, and when, of course, Gotabaya Rajapaksa allowed the wrong decisions economically, it was going to blow. But fortunately in Sri Lanka, it didn't go to those extreme lengths of violence. What's the difference there? How is it that Nepal is so violent? And we saw this in Bangladesh last year as well.
Yes.
These uprisings were very violent.
Yes.
But in Sri Lanka, it was a lot calmer.
Yes. Well, the nationalist in me would say that it's because, in terms of civic obedience and just a sense of civic duty, I would argue that we are better in general than most other South Asian countries. I would say that just as a population that is, I wouldn't want to say literate, but as I said, the sense of civic duty, the sense of civic responsibility, the sense of having to do things in some kind of reasoned way, I would argue that that's stronger here than in essentially any other South Asian country that we can name, including the Bangladeshis and the Nepals of the world. I would also argue that, so if you look at our specific situation, as you rightly pointed out, there was a political class and everybody could see that the leading political parties all belong to that same class, but we did not give up hope to the extent that we were willing to burn it all down in order to express our frustration. Whereas what happened in Nepal and to a certain extent in Dhaka as well was this sense of almost nihilism, where it was almost like we don't care what's coming next, we just want to burn and vent our anger. So I would say there are more parallels between what happened with us and Nepal. Some people look at it as a triangle, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh and Nepal. But you could also argue that the Bangladesh revolution had a lot of sectarian elements to it, whereas the Sri Lankan revolution and the Nepali revolution were pretty much secular revolutions. There are conspiracy theories, obviously, that there are foreign hands behind it, blah, blah, blah. There always will be. But in general, they were not sectarian revolutions. So there's that key thing that we need to keep in mind as well.
Right, and also compared to Nepal and Bangladesh, Sri Lanka has a much longer tradition of democracy. Perhaps that had something to do with it, because what I think the people, the public wanted was a return to proper democratic norms. That was the system change that they wanted. Whereas in Bangladesh and Nepal, they don't have that tradition of democracy.
Yes, and on top of that, many of these countries unfortunately have to rely on their armed forces to control crowds. And as you know, riot policing is a completely different science and art from fighting enemy soldiers on a battlefield. A soldier is trained to do soldiering, not crowd control and riot control. So in our part of the world, so if you look at Sri Lanka, for instance, because the armed forces have a lot of credibility among the common people to a certain extent, because of our own history and all that. And there was, at least in 2019-20, you could argue that as far as public institutions go, the armed forces have a somewhat better level of acceptance among the people than many other public institutions. Whereas in Nepal and Bangladesh, perhaps that played in as well, where they don't have the same kind of war experience to where the people feel some kind of kinship with the armed forces, because armies are not trained to do riot. You need dedicated riot police for that. You need proper equipment for that. You need proper training for that, proper simulation. Look at the United States, which, if you remember, during the 2020 election, during that COVID lockdown period, for about 7-8 months with the BLM protests, very violent protests across the United States. Businesses burned down, police stations burned down, some places just taken over by these activist groups. But the United States can hold on because they have dedicated riot police with the equipment and the training and the drilling and all that to get the situation under control. Whereas in this part of the world, we don't have that. So it can get inflamed very quickly. I mean, in all three of these cases, it was ultimately the armed forces who had to tell the head of state, sir or madam, it's over. You need to go. So, yeah.
Right. You, of course, referred to the Black Lives Matter, the rioting which took place in the US along with that movement. But you make a very valid point that armies don't train their soldiers for crowd control. Soldiers are taught about weapons and how to fight the enemy on the battlefield, not how to control crowds. So it's best when the militaries can stay out of these things.
Yes.
But in the case of Nepal, now we have had, of course, the military stepping in, because there's a vacuum now, isn't it? The
Yes.
president resigned, the prime minister resigned, so many cabinet ministers resigned, and there's chaos. So somebody had to step in.
Yes. So right now there are still, as we speak, currently there are discussions going on between the army chief and representatives from the Gen Z, protesters. Will they find a consensus candidate? I'm not too sure. Hopefully they will. Hopefully they will find a consensus candidate soon. But hopefully, much like how after the protests here and things got very dangerous, we were able to bring in some kind of political stability back to the country. So hopefully Nepal can do something like that. Of course, the problem is that they don't have anybody of that stature, like Mohammad Yunus in Bangladesh, like Ranil Wickremesinghe in Sri Lanka, whatever anybody's personal opinions might be of them. The reality is that they are internationally well-known elder figures, so to speak, who, whether we like them or not, could fill in that role at that time to just be the bandage that stops the bleeding.
And they are familiar to
Yes.
the population.
Yes.
And the population, after that initial period of violence, always accepts that somebody needs to take charge of the country. So at the moment with Nepal, we haven't got to that point, but hopefully within a very short period, they will return to normalcy and the country can move forward.
Absolutely. I mean, if I could just, so we could, from our perspective, from the Sri Lankan perspective, there's a positive way to look at this, and there's also a bit of a scary way to look at it. The positive way to look at it is, oh, we have a certain sense of solidarity now with this movement, because the same thing happened here. Anti-corruption movement driven by young people against what they saw to be a political class that was united regardless of which party they belonged to, and so on. But on the other hand, what's the government that's been currently overthrown? It was once a Marxist insurgent group that then came into the political system, and that was then rewarded by the people with votes as an alternative to the existing political rot that they had through the monarchy. So, and our current ruling party is also a, I mean, it's a coalition obviously, but the JVP is also an entity that has a very similar trajectory into politics. So you can either look at this as good news or as scary news if we were to project into the future.
But in the end, when a party gets into office, um, it is all about performing. And also, the public must see that performance and understand that there is a genuine effort going on and that things will get better. So if those two factors are not satisfied, then the public will turn around and say, well, these guys are no good as well.
Absolutely. You're right.
yeah.
And the Nepali government were warned so many times that things are brewing that they wouldn't like if that ever came to a boil. And they just ignored it. These signs have been around for a while now, and the entire Nepali ruling class just ignored everything.
But why is that? And again, we saw the same thing with Gotabaya Rajapaksa because it was very easy to look down the road. We had our forex reserves which were reducing for many years, and a lot of experts, including journalists, asked that question: what happens when there is no more forex in the country to pay for our imports? And it was a nightmare scenario,
Yes.
and that is exactly what it came down to. But the Gotabaya regime completely ignored that.
Yes.
And then what were the people expected to do?
Yeah.
They were expected to stand in petrol queues for a week and 2 weeks, and some people were dropping dead, and no one could get to work or to school. And in that kind of scenario, obviously an uprising has to happen,
Absolutely. And
but that's the same thing in Nepal. They ignored the warnings.
yes, and this is sometimes the contradiction of power. So, for instance, I mean, you and I could just sit down. If somebody asked us, hey, if somebody said to us, hey, 1/3 of our GDP is dependent on foreign remittances, the average age of our population is under 25. 1 in 2 people in this country have a smartphone, despite living in very, sort of substandard economic conditions. With all these factors, even a child would know that banning social media would create a meteoric, explosion in Nepali politics. What would have been obvious to even a child was not obvious to the rulers of Nepal. I mean, it's not like they don't know this. They know they have a young population. They know that 1/3 of their income comes from outside of their borders. And to ban social media despite knowing this, one has to wonder,
What were they thinking?
what were they thinking, and what advice were they being given? Because let's not forget, a head of state, sometimes we underestimate their decision making capacity as well, because when you're a head of state, most of your day is spent cutting ribbons, meeting people, shaking hands. Your secretary or whoever is shepherding you from one place to another, and you're always on the move, mostly doing ceremonial stuff. So it's your advisors whom you're depending on to give you the right advice. So you've also got to wonder what the advisors to the rulers were thinking, because this is something that even an illiterate would know that this would lead to a disaster.
But you mentioned, Nilanthan, that again the average age in Nepal is less than 25, but they were being ruled by a bunch of elderly people.
Yes.
And elderly people throughout the ages tend to lose touch with and not understand the aspirations of a younger generation.
Yes.
And the younger generation doesn't understand what in the world the elderly people are talking about.
Yes.
And there is this disconnect. So it's not even a matter of the years in between, it's a matter of being in touch with one another.
Yes.
You could be 75 years old, but if you are in touch with the younger generation, if you're moving with them,
Yes.
then you will understand their aspirations and they'll talk to you.
Yes.
But if you're hanging out with a bunch of fellow politicians
Yes.
who are also 75, 80, 90,
Yes.
as we saw in Sri Lanka, then you completely lose touch with the reality, which is the young population.
So true. I mean, Prime Minister Oli's statement after the social media ban was, who cares about social media? It's not that important. So the Prime Minister of Nepal, just banned social media under the impression that it's not that important and that nothing good ever came out of social media, despite his entire population using social media to talk to their family members abroad and to do business and all that. This is like that, the famous quote of Marie Antoinette, let them eat cake instead. This is almost that sort of the South Asian version of that, where they seem to have been just living in an alternate universe almost.
Now, what ramifications does the Nepal situation have on the rest of South Asia, and particularly on India, which is next door, and also the India-China sort of configuration there, because Nepal is sandwiched between those two
Yes.
giant countries and has always managed to somehow balance things politically. What is this going to do?
Okay, so this is where a bit of the conspiracy theory comes in as well. So I've heard some people say, so just as India and China try to come together, is it a coincidence that the one country between the two is now coming under political instability? Trump's tweets to China saying, we have a lot of secret cards that you're not aware of. So this is where some of those theories come in as well. Look, but ultimately, when you have a situation like this, it's very difficult to say that there was a foreign hand there, because you look at the conditions of the people there, and everything that we've discussed so far. Even if there was a foreign hand, certainly the local factors were what drove it through the roof, rather than an organizing hand, even if there was. Now, ramification for the South Asian region. Look at the narrative that's now all over the international media. Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, now Nepal. Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, now Nepal. South Asia on fire. People take to the streets in South Asia. People burn buildings in South Asia. So let's just say, from an investment climate point of view, that clearly has an impact on people willing to invest capital in South Asia. Right? Because we are small time players, but as you know, economies run on the big capital investments, that big companies. So when they look at risk assessments and all that, they will see that this is something which is extremely volatile, and they would be less eager to sink their funds into a region like South Asia. So incidentally, if I could just quickly plug, so something that CLASS does, something that we're starting from the 15th of September onwards, is Sri Lanka's first ever weekly geopolitical risk assessment. So it would be a service that you can subscribe to on our website, and every Monday morning you will get an email that gives you an overview of the things that happened all over the world, along with a risk assessment of how it would impact Sri Lanka and an assessment of how it would impact South Asia. Because as you know, many of these risk assessments exist all over the world, but we don't have one dedicated to Sri Lanka where that analysis looks at the grading of the threat level for us. So, for instance, as you know, Red Sea action by the Houthis, that impacts us directly because of trade and energy prices, remittances, and all that. The Russia Ukraine war has a slightly medium level impact on us, indirect impacts. And let's say the genocide in Congo or Sudan would be a low risk event because even though it's tragic, the genocide in the Sudan does not affect our day to day life. So, one of the things that we are doing is trying to empower the Sri Lankan public and the private sector with a risk assessment report every week so that we can also now protect ourselves from this. Because as you know, when we look at the impact of geopolitical events on Sri Lanka, often the problem is not the lack of intelligence or lack of decision making. It's simply a lack of knowledge because you're not going to get professional geopolitical expertise just by looking at Bloomberg or reading the headlines of some website. It requires people who've been doing this professionally as well. And if I could just now circle back to your question, let's look at India and how India would be viewing this, right? On the one hand, they now see the communist government of Nepal, which they were worried was getting closer to China, now crumbling. But at the same time, there's also a political vacuum now, which is not good for anybody. So I think India will just hope for the best. But I don't think India will be impacted by this very directly. But South Asia as a region, this just creates a narrative where we are now viewed as a highly volatile region in the world.
Interesting. And the need for a threat assessment, I mean, in whatever field, whether it is in economics, finance, or international relations, foreign relations, it is a very dire need, isn't it? And that's something that Sri Lanka, we haven't had. I mean, I suppose you could say that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs should be doing this, and I'm sure they do some sort of assessment, but it's not made public. So, for example, for our business leaders to know what's going on, especially India next door, and the rest of the region, we need to know what impact. And it's not just South Asia; it's around the world, isn't it? I mean, when Donald Trump was elected, the threat was immediate because he had said so in his campaign that he is going to implement massive tariffs throughout the world. But I suppose many countries really didn't expect him to follow through. But then from January, when he took over as president, he did continuously implement whatever he had promised.
And everybody was shocked.
Yes, and when finally in March he said, okay, in April this is happening, everybody was shocked. But they shouldn't have been.
They shouldn't have been. And that's because of precisely what you just said, which is that in general, so if we were to look at the 500 biggest companies in the world, all of them invest money in professional geopolitical risk assessment. Now, I would ask our audience to ask themselves, how many Sri Lankan companies invest in professional geopolitical assessments? This is a question that we need to ask. I mean, our own private sector, how seriously do they take this? To the point where, just like how you would go to a lawyer, just like how you would go to an accountant, how seriously is this practice taken? Because I can tell you it's taken very seriously by the successful companies around the world. But our elite here, I'm not too sure how keenly they understand the importance of this. And the result is things like what you said, where we are taken completely by shock, even though we shouldn't. We are taken completely by surprise, even though the other party has been telling us quite clearly that this is what's going to happen. And in terms of the other thing that you pointed out, public awareness itself, I mean, the strategic community here has unfortunately done the public a huge disservice, where there needs to be far more strategic discourse at the public level rather than the elite think tank level. Because we've had a lot of foreign policy discourse at the elite think tank level. I mean, you are a part of that discourse as well. But initiate programs like this, for instance, is the only way that the public has access to a little more sophisticated geopolitical analysis. Otherwise, the public has no access to it. So we wanted our risk report to be something like 1,000 rupees a month. Everybody can afford it. Even a student should be able to afford it. And the point is to get people interested in looking at the world in a strategic way and understanding that everything has an impact on us. It might be high impact, it might be low impact. That's a different case. But everything has an impact on us. And really, this initiative is to do that. It's to bring that culture of strategic thought to the Sri Lankan public.
Yes, and it's interesting, even Donald Trump's action when he announced in mid-March that he would be implementing global tariffs in April, which of course has been was delayed till August afterwards. But when he made this announcement in March, I must say that Newsfirst must take credit, because 2 weeks prior to that, on this very program, we had discussed this.
You did.
With an economist, that Donald Trump did make this threat way back last year when he was campaigning, and that he seems to be following up on whatever promises he made his voters. And we were, in fact, we signed off saying we hope he doesn't do it, but he might.
Yes.
And then 2 weeks later, bam.
Yes, I mean, and the fact that you were one of the only voices to even bring this out itself highlights the problem. We should have had 100 people like you bringing that message to the public. So the fact that it was once again just a handful of people who even have the capability of bringing these points to the public, that itself shows a huge vacuum in our strategic culture.
Right, but it's an absolute necessity for business, isn't it? Because we live in an era of the global supply chain.
Yes.
And even if we didn't, even if this were 50 years ago, we have our tea to sell. Of course, it's all homegrown, and then we have to send it out to export it. But we export it to countries like Russia and the UK, so we need to know what's happening over there.
Yes.
And too often we were taken by surprise. The examples are the Gulf War, the Iran-Iraq War before that, where both Iran and Iraq have always been big tea buyers for us. So that
absolutely.
has this,
and you brought up the very powerful example of people having to stand in line for basic fuel. Now, that was because of the global 2022 energy crisis. What we know today as the 2022 global energy crisis, we were one of the frontline casualties of that. And yet at that time, how many think tanks or intellectuals did we have here who could even contextualize the fact that all of these things were very intricately connected to factors that we did not prepare for or did not even anticipate? So yeah, you're absolutely right. We have the Fitch ratings for these reasons, right? So because companies, investors, anybody who wants to make sensible decisions, they know that some kind of matrix is important for decisions to be based off of.
Right, you have Fitch and S&P and Moody's and,
yes,
and several others.
Exactly.
Yes.
So we have all of this precisely because wise decision makers realize that there's value to this. So now the question is, how many of us can start adopting that so that we can now protect our own country from global shocks? Because the only weapons at our disposal, the only weapon really is knowledge. So let's equip ourselves with some knowledge at least in terms of what goes on around the world so that we can use that as a shield.
Right. And speaking of global shocks, this week we had several
Many.
more.
Yes.
One, of course, was the airstrike on Qatar by Israel, and that is actually an extension of the Gaza war, and suddenly it's all the way in Qatar, in Doha, which was quite unexpected. And of course, now the alarm bells are ringing, and there's global condemnation and so on, and there's um, no sign that it will go further than that. But again, something which was unexpected.
Yes.
So again, what kind of impact does it have now? I mean, I would think that for the Gaza war, well, it's bad news because a negotiated settlement would be that much more difficult.
Yes.
But what about the rest of the region, the Middle East, and then, of course, countries like us who depend on the Middle East?
Yes. So as you pointed out, there's been global condemnation. My question is, where is the Qatari condemnation? The Qatari Foreign Ministry's official statement was, "Oh, there's an insult. We are now conducting investigations." And that's it. It wasn't, "Oh my God, Israel has attacked Qatar. How dare you do it? We're going to retaliate." It was none of that. It was, we condemn the attack by Israel on Hamas leaders in our territory, and we will now investigate the matter. That's the official. So, did the Qataris actually have some secret green flag that they waved before the Israelis did this? We don't know, because Qatar also follows the London model, right? So, the London model before the London metro bombings was very simple. If you were a terrorist organization, you can come and set up an office in London as long as you don't attack London. The metro bombings changed that. So from the LTTE to almost every other insurgent group at one point, they had an office in London, which they would use as an international office. Qatar is now that. Qatar, many quote unquote terrorist organizations around the world have offices in Qatar, and Qatar then becomes the mediator of those conflicts. So if there was some tacit arrangement between the Israelis and the Qataris, and if Hamas found out about it, then there would be some kind of retaliation as a region. Yes, as you pointed out.
But
Yeah.
we are getting into a little bit of conjecture there, although in the real world, all these are, well, possibilities, because truth is stranger than fiction, and there's a lot of cloak and dagger stuff going on.
Yes.
But we may never know.
Yes.
But
So, because if Qatar had condemned this very strongly, that would have by Israel on sovereign Qatari soil. But not even the Qataris are claiming that this was an unprovoked Israeli attack on Qatari soil, which kind of was my point. And Qatar is a treaty ally of the United States. Israel is not. Israel is just a cultural ally of the United States. Qatar is a treaty ally, which means that an attack on Qatar is equivalent legally to an attack on the United States, and you can invoke collective security to now pressure your treaty allies into attacking. Qatar hasn't invoked any of that. Qatar hasn't even mentioned the doctrine of collective security. If they really were under attack, I would make the argument that they would have done that. So, as you rightly pointed out, this is conjecture, right? But the facts, as I see it, seem to contradict the conventional narrative somewhat.
But Nilanthan, what impact does this have on the region, or is it a one-off event? Because for us in Sri Lanka, I mean, Qatar is important because we have so many thousands of Sri Lankans living and working there. So any destabilization of Qatar would impact us in a big way. And of course, next to Qatar, you have, of course, the UAE, Bahrain, Kuwait, and so on. Yeah. So it's very important to us that the region should be stable for our people to live and work there.
And in fact, you could argue that the Middle East and Southeast Asia are really the two foreign regions that we have to pay very close attention to when it comes to the impact on the Sri Lankan economy. I personally don't see this blowing up. the Israeli-Qatari thing. If you remember, the Israelis have this very interesting tactic, right? They manipulated all the Hezbollah leaders a year ago into a building, and they bombed the building. They then manipulated all the Iranian leaders, herded them into a building, and then bombed the building. And now they've managed to get all the Hamas leaders in one building, and they've bombed the building. So this is also very consistent with a surgical strike strategy that the Israelis
So you
have.
don't think this is going to spread at all?
I hope not. I don't
Well,
think
that's
so.
very good to hear, actually.
Yes, I hope so. Right now, things seem to be, it seems to be a one-off thing.
Right. And we are almost out of time, but I have to broach the subject of Poland,
Yes.
where just a couple of days ago we had the claim by Poland that Russian drones had basically violated the airspace deep into Polish territory, and the Polish and other NATO allies
Yes.
responded, and it was Polish and Dutch jets which shot down these drones.
Iranian-made Russian drones.
Yes, and also I think several other NATO
Like
nations
Italy
were,
and all that,
yes, Italy provided, I think, a airborne tanker, and I think there was another country which provided command and control aircraft, and
Yes.
so it was suddenly it was NATO against Russia,
Yes.
but in a limited way. And of course, Russia has denied sending any drones into Poland.
Yes.
But is this again a one-off event?
So right now, it does seem to be a one-off event, because right now the Europeans have made it very clear that they will not put their own boots on the ground without the green light from the United States.
That's in Ukraine.
That's in Ukraine, and of course, because the thing is, Poland has already made it very clear that they will secure their airspace, but there's been no talk of retaliatory strikes. Of course, ironically, out of the European countries, Poland is the only one which has hit the 5% military spending target that Donald Trump wants European nations to hit. So, which is why Trump really likes the new right-wing, I think they have a different prime minister and a president. The prime minister and president are from two different parties in Poland at the moment. Familiar story, but the right-wing guy, Trump really likes him, and he's the one who's.
You're talking about Donald Tusk, is it?
No, not Tusk. The other guy.
The other guy.
The other guy. So Trump doesn't like Tusk that much, but he likes the other one. So I don't see this escalating into anything further at the moment, because Russia has very clearly taken up a de-escalatory tone, and Europe is not in any position to pressure Poland into doing anything further than this either, because Europe itself is falling apart. French government collapsing, stories that there's almost this kind of hidden civil war now brewing in the United Kingdom. Look at where, let's say, Le Pen was in France a few years ago, and where she is now in terms of popularity and anti-Macron sentiment and all that. Look at where Nigel Farage was. 15 years ago, Nigel Farage was considered a right-wing lunatic who would never ever get any kind of mainstream popularity. Today, you could argue that Nigel Farage is more popular than Starmer in terms of views on the ground. So the idea of Europe itself is kind of now at a huge state of crisis. So I don't see this particular incident sparking anything big. But when you're looking at
that's very good to hear from our point of view,
yes.
Because we do sell our apparel and our tea, and we have a lot of people who live in Europe as well. So from a Sri Lankan sort of selfish point of view, but then we have to have that selfish point of view because it's our country.
Yeah, and hopefully we sell more than apparel and tea. Right?
Yes.
So hopefully we come to a point where we are not looking at, no offense to apparel and tea, those are important, but if you want to be an industrial economy, it can't be the same 2 or 3 sectors that we speak about for 40 years as the backbones of our economy. What does it say, right? That tea and apparel are the backbone of a country's economy.
Well, that's a whole different discussion, and I'm sure we'll have that discussion soon as well. But I'm afraid we are now out of time. It's been a very interesting discussion indeed. Thank you very much, Nilanthan Niruthan, Executive Director of the Center for Law and Security Studies. And I hope you, the viewers, have got a full rundown now of what happened this week in the whole world and how it may or may not affect our region and Sri Lanka as a whole. Thank you very much for watching. Don't forget that the news is coming up next. And of course, have a great weekend.